The HOA president actually parked her pristine white SUV inside my private workshop, locked it, and told me she was utilizing a fake communal shade provision before marching off to a neighborhood brunch. I didn't yell or call a tow truck. Instead, I calmly plugged in my wire feed welder, grabbed some heavy square steel tubing, and permanently fused my own garage doors to the tracks. 4 hours later, I was sitting miles away at a quiet lake with a cold drink, watching a live high-definition security feed on my phone as she returned with her pastel-wearing friends to retrieve her hostage vehicle. My name is David, I'm 42 years old, and I make my living as a custom metal fabricator. I spent my whole weekend watching that woman scream at unmoving steel, call the county sheriff to demand my arrest, and eventually roundhouse kick a commercial-grade door in pointed kitten heels. But before I show you exactly how hard she face-planted into my front lawn, you need to know how this dictator backed herself into a trap she couldn't buy her way out of. I want you to imagine a smell. Not a bad smell, just a very specific one. It is a mix of old motor oil, sawdust, burnt metal from a welding torch, and coffee that has been sitting in a thermos since 6 in the morning. That is the smell of my workshop. It is a detached garage sitting at the very back of my property, right on the edge of the neighborhood. It is my sanctuary. It is the one place in the world where my phone stays in my pocket and the rest of the planet ceases to exist, or at least that is how it is supposed to work. Then there is Brenda. Every neighborhood has a Brenda, but our Brenda was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Homeowners Association. She walked like she was constantly stepping over puddles only she could see. She wore these stiff pastel cardigans no matter how hot it was, and she carried a clipboard. Not an iPad, not a notebook, a literal wooden clipboard with a cheap plastic pen dangling from a coiled spring. She used that pen to point at things she did not like. She pointed at my garden hose once. She pointed at my truck tires twice. But on a Friday morning in late June, Brenda decided to point that pen at my entire life. I had the big roll-up bay doors of my shop wide open. It was going to be 90 degrees by noon, and I wanted to let the cool morning air circulate before I locked everything up and headed up to the lake for a 3-day fishing trip. I'd been planning this trip for 2 months. The truck was packed. The bait cooler was iced down. I just needed to organize some scrap metal in the back corner of the shop, sweep the concrete, and hit the road. I stepped out of the back man door to grab a push broom leaning against the side of the building. I was gone for exactly 45 seconds. When I walked back around to the front, there was a vehicle parked inside my workshop. Not in my driveway, not on the street. Inside my actual building. It was a pristine, aggressively washed white crossover sport utility vehicle. It smelled like heavily perfumed leather cleaner and Audacity. The tires were perfectly aligned on my concrete floor, sitting directly over a faint oil stain I had been meaning to scrub out. I stopped. I blinked. I looked around, genuinely thinking I might be having some sort of silent stroke. And then I heard the click-clack of sensible kitten heels walking down my driveway. I stepped out of the shadow of the garage. Brenda was marching away, clipboard tucked under her arm, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "Brenda," I said. I kept my voice perfectly flat. "What is your car doing inside my shop?" She did not even turn around. She just stopped, adjusted her cardigan, and looked over her shoulder with a smile that belonged on a door-to-door vacuum salesman. "I am utilizing the shade, David," she said. "You are parked inside my building." She turned fully around then, holding the clipboard against her chest like a shield. "The sun is exceptionally harsh today, David. My clear coat is sensitive to ultraviolet degradation. And since you clearly were not using the space and the doors were wide open, it falls under the communal shade provision." "The what?" "The communal shade provision," she said, her voice rising in that sickly sweet pitch people use when they think they are talking to a toddler. Section 4, Paragraph 9 of the Community Bylaws. Any outward-facing, open-air structure not actively in use during peak heat hours can be temporarily utilized for property preservation. I stared at her. I had lived here for 6 years. I had read the bylaws. There was no communal shade provision. She had literally just made it up on the spot, stringing corporate-sounding words together to justify treating my private property like a public parking garage. If you have ever had to deal with an association dictator who honestly believes the universe owes them a premium parking spot just because they own a clipboard, pause for a second and let me know in the comments how you handled it, because you know exactly how my jaw felt hitting the concrete. "Brenda," I said, taking a slow, deep breath. "That is not a real rule. This is a private building, on private property. You have exactly 1 minute to get back in that oversized golf cart and back it out of my life." She sighed loudly. It was a wet, dramatic sigh. "I am hosting the beautification committee brunch at my house in 10 minutes, David. My driveway is reserved for the caterer. I will move my vehicle at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Do not touch it. Do not lean on it. Have a blessed day." She turned around and began marching down the street toward her house. "I am going fishing in 1 hour, Brenda," I called after her. "I am locking these doors." "Then I suppose you will just have to leave them open, won't you?" she yelled back without stopping. "Or the association will fine you for reckless endangerment of a neighbor's vehicle." She clicked her key fob without looking back. I heard the sharp chirp of the car locking from inside my shop. I stood there in the driveway for a long time. I looked at the street. I looked at the perfectly manicured lawns. I looked at my neighbor Gary, who was sitting on his front porch next door. Gary is a retired plumber who wears suspenders over plain white t-shirts and considers talking to be a waste of energy. He had a mug of black coffee in one hand. He was looking right at me. Gary took a slow sip of his coffee. He gave me a single, slow nod. That was all the validation I needed. I did not yell. I did not run after her. I did not call a tow truck. Tow trucks take 2 hours, and sometimes they refuse to pull a car out of a private enclosed structure because of liability issues. No, I am a fabricator by trade. I solve problems with heat, metal, and wire. I walked into my shop and looked at the white vehicle taking up my floor space. I walked over to my workbench. I unplugged the radio. I plugged in my wire feed welder. The plan was not malicious. It was simply compliance. I told her I was locking the doors. I am a man of my word, but standard locks can be clipped. Standard padlocks can be defeated by a determined woman with a bolt cutter and an inflated sense of authority. I needed something a little more permanent. My shop has 2 main commercial-grade steel roll-up doors. They ride on heavy steel tracks, bolted directly into the concrete block walls. I walked over to the scrap rack. I pulled out 4 pieces of thick, square steel tubing. Heavy-duty stuff. The kind of steel you build trailer frames out of. I dragged them over to the closed bay door. I grabbed my welding helmet. I slipped it over my head. I grounded the clamp to the heavy steel track of the door. I lined up the first piece of square tubing horizontally across the tracks, essentially creating an immovable steel barricade bolted directly to the architecture of the building. I pulled the trigger on the welding gun. The brilliant blue-white flash lit up the dim garage. Sparks showered down onto the concrete floor, dancing around the front tires of Brenda's pristine white crossover. The smell of ozone and burning flux core filled the air, completely wiping out the smell of her perfumed leather interior. I laid down a beautiful, thick bead of molten metal, fusing the square tubing to the heavy steel door track. I did the left side. I did the right side. Then I moved down 3 feet and welded a second bar across. I walked over to the second bay door, the one right behind her car. I pulled down the heavy metal door. It slammed into the concrete with a satisfying, echoing boom. I repeated the process. 2 massive steel bars welded solid directly across the tracks. A tank could not drive through those doors now. You would literally have to tear down the building to get them open. I lifted my mask. The metal was glowing a dull orange, slowly fading to gray as it cooled. I tapped the weld with my heavy leather glove. Solid as a rock. Then, I hit my first snag. I turned around to leave, feeling incredibly proud of myself, and realized my fishing tackle box was sitting on the workbench at the very back of the shop. To get it, I had to squeeze past the rear bumper of Brenda's car. I squeezed past. My heavy denim work jeans rubbed right against her perfectly waxed rear quarter panel. I grabbed the tackle box. I squeezed back. I almost dropped a heavy pair of pliers directly onto her hood, but I caught them at the last second. My heart spiked for a moment, not because I cared about scratching her car, but because I did not want her to have a single valid property damage claim against me. This had to be perfectly clean. I walked out the sideman door. It was a heavy, solid core steel door. I shut it tight. I pulled out a heavy-duty, hardened steel padlock and snapped it through the exterior latch. Then, I went to my truck, pulled out a stack of metal signs I had bought years ago and never used, and grabbed my cordless drill. I drilled 4 screws into the outside of the man door, attaching a bright red and white sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." I walked around to the front of the shop. I drilled another sign directly into the center of the metal roll-up door. No parking. Private property. I threw my drill into the truck bed. I looked over at Gary's porch. Gary was still there. The coffee mug was resting on his knee now. "You're not going to be able to open those doors on Sunday evening, Dave," Gary said. His voice sounded like gravel rolling around in a hubcap. "I have an angle grinder in the truck, Gary," I said. Gary raised his mug in the air. "Good man." I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away. The drive up to the lake took 2 hours. It is a beautiful drive, winding up through the foothills, leaving the manicured lawns and the passive-aggressive neighborhood emails far behind. I rolled the windows down. I let the wind blow through the cab. I felt the tension of the city just melting off my shoulders. I pulled into my favorite campsite right around 2:30 in the afternoon. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the dark green of the pine trees lining the shore. I set up my tent. I got my folding chair out. I opened a cold drink. I baited my hook and cast my line out into the deep water. Then, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened my home security camera app. I have a very high-definition camera mounted right above the driveway, pointed directly at the shop doors. It records audio. It has motion alerts. It is a beautiful piece of technology. I settled back into my folding chair, listening to the gentle lap of the lake water against the rocky shore, and I stared at the screen. The doors were shut. The signs were visible. Everything was quiet. I am sitting there, cold drink in hand, just waiting for the show to start. If you are ready to watch Brenda completely lose her mind on a 6-inch screen, tap that like button and let me know what snack you would bring to this watch party, because the main event is about to begin. 4 o'clock came and went. I caught a decent-sized bass, released it, and checked my phone again. Nothing. 4:30, nothing. 5:15. My phone buzzed in my hand. Motion detected at the workshop. I tapped the notification immediately. The live feed loaded. There was Brenda. She was walking down my driveway, surrounded by 2 other women from the beautification committee. They were all wearing pastel colors. They looked like a walking Easter basket. Brenda was talking animatedly, waving her hands, clearly riding the high of a successful brunch. She walked right up to the front bay door of my shop. She reached into her purse and pulled out her key fob. She pressed it. I heard the muffled chirp of the car inside the sealed steel drum of the garage. Brenda grabbed the handle on the exterior of the door. She pulled up. Nothing happened. She frowned. She looked at her friends. She grabbed the handle with both hands and gave it a sharp, aggressive yank. The door did not even rattle. The welds held it completely solid against the concrete blocks. "David!" she yelled at the closed door. "David, open this right now!" Her voice came through the camera microphone crisp and clear. I took a sip of my drink. A bird chirped somewhere in the pine trees above me. It was very peaceful. Brenda marched over to the side man door. She saw the heavy padlock. She saw the "No Trespassing" sign. She grabbed the padlock and rattled it violently. "He locked it!" she shrieked, turning back to her friends. "He actually locked it!" One of her friends, a woman wearing a sun hat the size of a satellite dish, pointed timidly at the sign on the main door. "Brenda, it says violators will be locked in." "I am not a violator," Brenda screamed, her voice cracking. "I am the president of the association!" She marched back to the main door. She balled her hands into fists and started banging on the corrugated metal. "David, I know you are in there. You are hiding. Open this door immediately, or I am calling the authorities." She banged for 2 solid minutes. I watched her face get redder and redder. The camera resolution was so good I could see the sweat forming on her forehead. She was not used to the word no. She was certainly not used to the word no being enforced by 3/8-inch structural steel. Finally, she whipped out her phone. She dialed furiously. She paced back and forth in my driveway, waving her free hand in the air. "Yes, I need an officer dispatched immediately," she yelled into the phone. "I have a stolen vehicle situation, a hostage situation. My vehicle is being held hostage inside a building." She paused, listening to the dispatcher. "No, I am not inside the building. The car is inside the building. The homeowner trapped it." Another pause. "Because I parked it there. It is a communal shade space. Just send a deputy." She hung up. She stood with her arms crossed, glaring at my security camera. She knew it was there. She stared right into the lens. "You are going to jail, David," she said, directly to the camera. I smiled. I reeled in my line, checked my bait, and cast it back out into the lake. 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the front of my shop. A White County Sheriff's Patrol SUV pulled into my driveway. A deputy stepped out. He looked young. He looked tired. He adjusted his duty belt and walked slowly toward Brenda, who was already running toward him like he was a long-lost relative. "Officer," she cried out, "thank goodness! You need to breach these doors. He has stolen my vehicle." The deputy stopped and looked at the closed doors. He looked at the massive no parking signs. He looked at the private property sign. He pulled a small notepad out of his shirt pocket. "Ma'am, you said your vehicle is inside this garage?" the deputy asked. His voice was calm, deep, and completely unimpressed. "Yes. I parked it there this morning to protect my clear coat, and this absolute lunatic locked the doors and refused to let me out." The deputy wrote something down. He did not look up. "Why did you park inside a private residential garage, ma'am?" "It was open. The doors were open. Under the community bylaws, it is a communal shade structure." The deputy finally looked up. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. "Ma'am, I do not enforce homeowners association bylaws. I enforce the law. The law says this is private property." "But he took my car." "Did he drive it away?" "No, he trapped it." "Did he force you to drive it inside?" "No, I parked it there. I just told you that." The deputy sighed. It was a sigh of a man who realized he was going to be late for dinner. "Ma'am, if you willingly parked your car inside his private building and he secured his private building, that is not motor vehicle theft. That is a civil matter. I cannot force entry into a secured private structure without a warrant." Brenda's mouth fell open. Her friends gasped. "You are the police," Brenda yelled, stepping toward him. "You have a gun. Shoot the lock." The deputy took half a step back. His hand rested casually near his radio. "I am absolutely not going to discharge my firearm into a padlock over a parking dispute, ma'am. You need to contact the homeowner and resolve this civilly. He is ignoring me. He went fishing." "Then I suggest you wait until he gets back from fishing." The deputy closed his notepad. He slipped it back into his pocket. "Have a good evening, ladies. Try to stay off private property." He turned around and walked back to his patrol vehicle. Brenda was vibrating. She was literally shaking with rage. She watched the deputy pull out of the driveway and drive away down the street. Her friends were slowly backing away toward the sidewalk, clearly realizing the blast radius of this explosion was going to be large. Brenda turned back to the garage door. She stared at it. She looked at the no parking sign, and then She lost completely whatever shred of rational control she had left. She let out a primal, unhinged scream, wound up her right leg, and kicked the heavy corrugated steel door with everything she had. Now, remember what I said about those kitten heels? They are pointy. They have zero ankle support, and my garage door is commercial grade, heavy gauge steel, backed by two solid steel bars welded directly into the concrete block. The kick landed with a massive, echoing metallic boom, and instantly the scream of rage turned into a gasp of absolute agony. Brenda bounced backward. Her right shoe flew off into the grass. She grabbed her foot with both hands, losing her balance completely. She hopped backward on her left foot, trying to stay upright, making this high-pitched, squeaking noise like a deflating balloon. She hopped once. She hopped twice. She hit the slight slope where the driveway meets the grass, completely lost her center of gravity, and went down. She landed squarely on her backside in my front lawn. Her clipboard, which had been tucked under her arm, went flying. The cheap plastic pen snapped right off the coiled spring and landed in the dirt. I was sitting by the lake, hundreds of miles away, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my drink. I snorted. I wheezed. A flock of ducks on the water took flight because of the noise I made. On the screen, Brenda's friends finally rushed forward to help her up. She swatted them away. She was entirely covered in grass clippings and humiliation. She limped over to her shoe, jammed her foot back into it, and hobbled down the street without looking back. Her friends hurried after her, carrying her broken clipboard. The driveway was empty again. The shop was silent. The sun was starting to set on the camera feed, casting long, peaceful shadows over my locked steel doors. The rest of my weekend was glorious. The fish were biting. The weather was perfect. The beer was cold. I did not check the camera again until Sunday morning. When I opened the app, I saw that the sheriff had returned late Saturday night. A different deputy this time. A supervisor, probably called in because Brenda escalated the complaint up the chain of command. I watched the recorded footage. The supervisor shined a flashlight at the doors, read the signs, walked over to Brenda, who was standing on the sidewalk in a bathrobe, and essentially told her the exact same thing the first deputy did. Private property, civil matter. Wait for the owner. She had yelled, he had shrugged. He left. I packed up my campsite Sunday afternoon. I took my time. I stopped for a burger on the way home. I drove the speed limit. Pulled into my neighborhood just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. I backed my truck into the driveway, right up to the shop doors. Gary was on his porch. He had switched from coffee to a glass of iced tea. "Good trip?" Gary asked across the lawn. "Caught a limit," I said, stepping out of the truck. "Quiet weekend." "Not around here," Gary said, rattling the ice in his glass. "Been a regular circus. Lot of yelling. Lot of pacing." I smiled. I went to the back of my truck, opened the tailgate, and pulled out my heavy-duty cordless angle grinder. I slapped a fresh cutting wheel onto it and grabbed my safety glasses. I unlocked the man door. I walked inside. The white crossover was still sitting exactly where she left it. It was completely dark inside the shop. I went to the main door, put my safety glasses on, and turned the grinder on. It whined with a high-pitched, aggressive scream. I laid the cutting wheel right into the thick steel welds. Sparks showered backward over my boots. It took me about 10 minutes of loud shower of sparks, heavy metal cutting to break through the 4 weld points. I kicked the steel tubing free. It clattered loudly onto the concrete. I grabbed the chain hoist and hauled the heavy roll-up door open. The cool evening air rushed into the shop. And there was Brenda, standing at the edge of my driveway. She was wearing sweatpants. The pastel cardigans were gone. She looked exhausted. She did not have her clipboard. She marched up to the open door. She did not say a word to me. She walked past me, radiating sheer hostility, and went straight to her car door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened. She slid into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut. I stood by the open bay door, holding my grinder, waiting. Through the windshield, I saw her press the push to start button. Nothing happened. I saw her press it again, harder. Nothing. She slammed her hands against the steering wheel. She opened the car door and stepped out. "You disconnected my battery!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the shop. "I did not touch your car, Brenda," I said calmly. "I told you I wouldn't." "Then why won't it start?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Well, you locked it with the fob when you left on Friday. But I noticed when I squeezed past it that your dashboard lights were on. You left the accessory power running, probably listening to the radio before you got out. After 3 days in a locked garage, your battery is completely dead." She stared at me. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked at the car. She looked at me. The realization that every single bad thing that had happened this weekend was entirely the result of her own actions washed over her face in real time. It was beautiful. She slowly reached into her pocket. She pulled out her phone. "I need to call a tow truck to jump-start it," she muttered quietly. "Good luck," I said. "It is Sunday night. That will take a while." I walked over to the man door. I stepped out into the yard. "Hey, Gary," I called out. Gary looked over. "You still have those jumper cables in your garage?" Gary took a slow sip of his iced tea. He looked at Brenda standing helplessly in my dark workshop. He looked at me. "No," Gary said, completely deadpan. "I think I lost them." He hadn't lost them. "I saw them a few days ago on his wall." I turned back to Brenda. I gave her a polite, neighborly nod. "I am going inside to clean my fish, Brenda. Make sure you close the door on your way out." I left her standing there in the dark next to her dead, hostage vehicle. I walked up to my house, unlocked the front door, and went inside. The next morning, the car was gone. The shop was empty. The neighborhood was very, very quiet. Brenda resigned from the association board 3 weeks later. She sent out an email citing health reasons and stress. She stopped carrying the clipboard. She stopped walking in the street. When she drives past my house now, she looks straight ahead, her hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I finally scrubbed that oil stain off the concrete floor. I reorganized my scrap rack. I fixed the little burn marks where my welds had scorched the paint on the door tracks. The shop smells like motor oil and coffee again. The doors stay wide open whenever I want, and the air is absolutely perfect.